As far back as the early 17th century, China and African countries began establishing trade and cultural relations. Today, a lot has transpired between these two entities, especially in economic affairs, which are greatly significant and visible. Sino-African relations have created a lot of impact on both of them, up to the extent where African countries are now indebted to China. China is one of the biggest foreign lenders in Africa. This year, the country gave out loans in Africa worth about $200 billion. These loans are being used for a number of projects, such as the construction of infrastructures, developmental projects, diplomacy, healthcare, agriculture, and many others. As of 2022, African countries have contracted Chinese debts worth more than $700 billion. China has been Africa's largest trading partner since 2009, when it surpassed the United States. It continues to maintain this great position despite the recent hindrance by the COVID-19 pandemic. However, Bronigam's research has revealed that China canceled at least $3.4 billion of such debts for 17 countries in Africa this year. Some African countries with the biggest debt burdens in relative terms are Angola, Djibouti, Kenya, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Zambia. You will get to know more about other countries with Chinese debt as you watch keenly through this video. We shall present to you Africa's debt situation with China under several topics, such as how much money was gotten, for what purpose, projects realized, and the amount of money held as debts for each of the projects and countries involved. Let's ride on. What has caused African countries to procure debts from China? We all know that China is a far more developed and technologically advanced nation, better than every African country. To enhance such growth in Africa, there is always a need to get aid from somewhere like China. For many years now, there have been exchanges between China and African states, that is, they both do the importation and exportation of varied goods and services. China trades with almost all the 54 countries in Africa, with South Africa being the principal export market, followed by Nigeria and Egypt. The United Nations reported in 2019 that Chinese exports to North African countries such as Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Morocco, and Tunisia amounted to over $27 billion. This amount made approximately 28% of what China gave to the entire continent. In return, imports from North Africa were only $7 billion in monetary terms. These differences in import and export values, with China as the main party supporting, have led to a debt increase in Africa. Sino-African relations have been operating over the years. In fact, China began its foreign aid program in Africa. If all these aids were to be paid for, then the debt amount would even be greater in Africa. The pioneer sub-Saharan African country to receive Chinese aid was Guinea in building infrastructures following its independence from France. Between 2000 and 2014, African countries rapidly increased their borrowing from China, summing up to about $95 billion to end their dependence on the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which called for market liberalization in exchange for loans. This, since then, is also responsible for Africa's indebtedness to China. How has China invested in Africa, and what is the cost? As earlier mentioned, China has invested in many businesses in Africa over the years. These investments, however, are not backed by the free obtaining of goods. A clear amount of China's spending in Africa cannot be easily ousted, but according to the Economic Times, the total amount China has lent to some African countries between 2017 and now is as follows. Angola, $23 billion, Ethiopia, more than $16 billion, Kenya, $18 million, the Democratic Republic of Congo, approximately $12 billion, and $10.5 billion to Cameroon. African countries, which supply some of the raw materials, tend to buy from the Chinese, and at times, they get the goods on credit. This also accounts for their debt to China. Findings from the China-Africa Research Initiative have indicated that, although African countries are indebted to China, still, China has played a significant role to manage their debt. Between the years 2000 and 2020, China wrote off accumulation arrears of at least 94 interest-free loans to Africa, amounting to about $3.4 billion US. However, these interest-free loans make up only less than 5% of China's lending to Africa. Many African countries still obtain loans from different places, including China and other countries, to finance critical infrastructure and various development projects. According to the IMF, about $285 billion will be needed by African countries to pay their Chinese debts. Which are the African countries with the most significant debt to China? Africa's rising debts to China have exceeded $350 billion US. Angola, Ethiopia, Zambia, Kenya, Egypt, Nigeria, Cameroon, South Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Ghana were the top recipients of Chinese loans between the years 2000 and 2020. These loans were committed to 5 information and communication technology projects, 3 power projects, 2 transport projects, and 1 banking project. In the past years, transport and power projects in African countries received a lion's share of the loans. As of 2020, the ICT sector pulled ahead, receiving about $568 million US worth of these loans. The COVID-19 pandemic impacted many African economies by restricting the fiscal space to service debts, which even increased Africa's willingness to borrow more from China. So far, China has tried to relieve the debt burden of most African countries. Some of them, like Madagascar and Niger, have remarked that the cancellation of even $50 million US from their total debts to China will make a meaningful difference to their ability to pay for basic services. Meanwhile, others like Ghana and South Africa, on the other hand, are particularly worried about their own debt to China. Their fears include worsening pressures on domestic currencies, which may likely accelerate their financial instability. When you like our videos, it encourages us to produce more content for you. Feel free to like this video now and subscribe to our channel before we continue. After hearing how and why African countries are indebted to China, you may also be interested in knowing what the aftermath will look like by asking more questions. Here are 2 questions you may want to get clarification on. The first one is, does Africa still need Chinese support despite the debt level? And secondly, what is the repayment plan for these loans? Let's answer the first question. Does Africa still need Chinese support? As you already know, Sino-African relations have existed for several decades now, and what each of them has benefited from each other is quite encouraging, despite the problem of debts on the part of African countries. China's decision to cancel some of the debts of 17 African countries is an indication on her part that the mutual relationship with Africa should continue. All African countries are still lagging in various aspects, and it will only be through external relations and comparisons that they will step out of their standard of least developed countries in the world. There is no foreign country that has much engagement in Africa as China does. China is the largest trading partner, bilateral creditor, and crucial source of infrastructural development for Africa. The country's investments in Africa are very important because through this, many Africans have been employed, and there are still a good number of job opportunities awaited. Many people believe that China's economic influence on Africa is somewhat very positive. Despite significant evidence of Chinese-led job creation in Africa, there are still issues with the labor practices which do not often promote Africans to higher ranks within Chinese-owned businesses. What is the repayment plan? It is true that almost every African country is indebted to China, but what has been done to solve this problem? At least 18 African countries have been renegotiating their debts with China, while 12 others are still holding talks to make China cancel approximately $28 billion US from their loans. Some countries like Kenya are already promising to pay back $60 billion US to the China Exim Bank. Angola too is working hard to refund theirs through an increase in oil extraction. Between 2010 and 2022, Nigeria's debt to China has also grown by 150%, and the country had to spend $195 million in 2020 as debt repayment to China. In other countries, like Djibouti, China has provided funds that mount up to about 75% of the country's GDP. Zambia is negotiating with Chinese lenders to look at their situation and make favorable their debt records. The African countries are also part of the G20 Finance and Central Bank Governors Conferences, where measures are taken to relieve their debt burden are being discussed. Some of these countries are trying to get out of this debt trap, although they may not necessarily heed instant measures. Africa's debt to China for this year stands at more than $700 billion. China has also played part in relieving the debt burden on African nations by bringing down loan rates, which is highly appreciated by some of the countries. China canceled 17 African countries' loans worth $3.4 billion in 2022. Although this has been done, some countries still fear what their future fiscal policy will hold. If there are any more facts you would have loved to hear in this video, please do not hesitate to drop them in the comment section below. The New Tourist is the place where you get all that you want to know about the African continent. Help us grow by liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and also recommend it to your loved ones. After doing this, turn on the notification bell so that you don't miss any of our videos. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.